The wind howled across the endless plains like a living thing, sharp as a knife's edge, carrying flecks of ice that stung Clara Mae Donovan's cheeks as she stepped down from the stagecoach. The wooden wheels had barely ground to a halt when the driver called out, "Last stop, Dry Creek." His voice was hoarse, his breath a pale ghost against the frozen air. Clara pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, but the Wyoming wind tore right through the wool as though mocking her. Her boots, scuffed and worn from weeks of travel, sank into the crusted snow and she hesitated, her heart thundering with a mixture of fear and resolve. She had left everything behind in Kansas, the grave of a husband she barely had time to love, a burned-out farmhouse stripped bare by drought and locusts, and the shame of returning home to nothing but debts she could never repay. Now she stood, on the edge of a strange wild land where the horizon stretched forever, and danger hid in every shadow. Outlaws roamed freely, native tribes defended their dwindling hunting grounds. Winter itself killed as swiftly as any bullet. But Clara had no choice. Somewhere beyond the frozen hills waited Jackson Hale, a man she'd never met, but whose words, on a fragile piece of paper, had felt like salvation. A good home, warm hearth, a fresh start. If you are willing to be a wife, you will never want for shelter or bread. It wasn't love she'd come for. It was survival. The lonely rancher. Lone Rider waited by the hitching post, his tall frame outlined against the gray winter sky. He sat his horse with the ease of a man born in the saddle, a battered hat pulled low over storm-colored eyes. His coat was long, leather cracked and faded, and a hunting rifle rested in the scabbard at his knee. "Mrs. Donovan?" His voice was low and rough like gravel under boot leather. Clara nodded, clutching her carpet bag so tightly her knuckles blanched. "Yes, I'm Clara Mae." The man dipped his head in the smallest of acknowledgments. "Jackson Hale." Up close he looked younger than she expected, 30 at most, but the lines around his mouth and the weariness in his gaze made him seem older, carved out of hard years and harder losses. Something in his eyes unsettled her. A flicker of sorrow, a shadow of guilt he tried to hide beneath silence. Without another word, he took her bag and tied it behind the saddle. "Storm's coming. We'd best ride." She mounted awkwardly behind him, clutching his coat for balance as the horse surged forward into the cold, white wilderness. Ghosts on the prairie. The ride to the ranch took hours, the vastness of the plains swallowing all sound but the crunch of hooves in snow. The sky hung low, swollen with dark clouds that promised another storm. Jackson rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were clipped and careful, as though weighed against some private burden. Clara's questions about the ranch, the nearest town, even his family, were met with short answers. Finally, she ventured softly, "I heard your wife passed." He stiffened beneath her hands. For a long moment he said nothing, and she thought perhaps she'd overstepped. Then, without turning, he muttered, "That's what folks say." The words chilled her more than the wind. Rumors had followed his. "Letter," whispered by the stagecoach driver, murmured at the inn in Cheyenne. Jackson Hale's wife had vanished 2 winters ago without a trace. Some claimed she'd run off with a drifter. Others whispered darker tales, that Jackson had buried her somewhere under the frozen earth. Clara told herself not to listen, but as she clung to him on the endless ride, she couldn't shake the weight of those whispers. A ranch of silence. When they crested the final rise, the Hale Ranch sprawled below them, a lonely stretch of land hemmed in by black hills, fenced pastures half buried under snow, and a weathered 2-story house whose windows glimmered faintly with lamplight. Inside, warmth finally greeted her. The scent of wood smoke clung to the walls, mingled with leather, horses, and something faintly bitter she couldn't place. Jackson showed her to a modest bedroom at the end of the hall, its single window frosted over, the bed neatly made. "You'll sleep here," he said simply, setting her bag down. Clara touched the quilt, hand-sewn but faded. She thought of the house she'd grown up in, filled with laughter and noise, and wondered if this silent place could ever feel like home. Later, over a sparse supper of beans and cornbread, she finally asked the question that had sat heavy on her chest since she'd stepped off the stagecoach. Why me? Jackson glanced up, his gray eyes unreadable. I needed someone who'd stay. The answer left her hollow and full all at once. She had come west seeking security, but part of her had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that this arrangement might bloom into something more. Shadows of danger. That night, as the wind battered the windows, Clara lay awake listening to the creaks of the old house and the restless whinnying of horses in the barn. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, joined by another and another, until the night itself seemed alive with predators. She rose and peeked through the frosted glass. Beyond the pale moonlight on snow, she saw a figure moving near the barn, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably familiar. It wasn't Jackson. Whoever it was slipped inside the shadows, and the horses grew restless, stamping and snorting. When Jackson came to her door moments later, rifle in hand, she didn't need to ask if he'd seen him too. "Stay inside," he said quietly, his voice tight with something unspoken. "Who is it?" she whispered. His jaw clenched. "Nobody you need to know." But she saw it in his eyes, fear, guilt, and something else she couldn't name. The Wyoming plains stretched wide and silent beneath a bruised winter sky, but the wind never seemed to rest. It whistled through the fences and rattled the barn, doors seeping into every corner of the Hale Ranch like an unwelcome spirit. For Clara Mae Donovan, the days blurred together, a slow rhythm of chores and endless cold quiet. Every morning she rose before dawn, shivering in her thin nightdress as she stoked the stove and fetched water from the frozen pump. She swept the wooden floors, patched worn quilts, and cooked meals for a man who barely spoke at the table. Jackson Hale was a mystery she couldn't unravel. He spent most of his days out on the range, riding fence lines or breaking ice in the cattle troughs, returning only when the sun sank low. Even then, his silence filled the house like another presence, heavy, unyielding, and impossible to ignore. And yet, despite his distance, Clara found herself watching him when she thought he wouldn't notice. The set of his shoulders beneath his worn coat. The way his hands, rough and scarred from years of work, handled a coffee cup as though it were something fragile. The flicker of loneliness that crossed his face when he thought no one was looking. Some nights she heard him pacing downstairs long after midnight. Other times she swore she heard whispers, the floorboards creaking under a weight that wasn't hers, murmured words she couldn't quite make out. This house was quiet, but it wasn't at peace. The storm and the spark. The first true thaw of spring brought with it a storm that rolled over the plains without warning. Dark clouds piled high over the distant hills, swallowing the sun, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. Jackson returned from the pastures just as the rain broke, driving his horse hard across the yard. Clara ran to the barn to help, skirts clinging to her legs in the downpour. Together they wrestled the stubborn barn doors shut as lightning split the horizon. By the time they made it inside, both were drenched, shivering in the dim light of a single lantern. Clara's breath caught as she realized how close they were standing, her wet hair clinging to her cheeks, his rough hands still gripping hers from forcing the doors closed. For a moment, neither spoke. The storm raged around them, thunder shaking the earth, but inside the barn, there was only the quiet thud of two racing hearts. Jackson released her hands slowly, almost reluctantly. "Best not catch cold," he murmured, turning away to tend to the lantern. But Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided her gaze. It was the first time she'd seen him falter, and it left her breathless with questions she didn't dare ask. Unspoken truths that night. The storm battered the ranch, trapping them inside. Jackson lit a fire, its glow softening the sharp angles of his face as they sat across from each other at the table. For the first time since her arrival, he poured them both whiskey. Strong, burning, and far too smooth for the brand sold in town. "How long has this ranch been in your family?" Clara asked, searching for something, anything, to pierce the silence between them. Jackson's gaze lingered on the flames. "My father claimed this land after the war, said it was God's country. Hard, but honest. He died out here, same as my mother. And your wife? The question hung between them like a blade. Jackson's jaw tightened, but this time he didn't retreat into silence. She's gone, he said finally, his voice low, roughened by something that sounded like regret. Best to leave it there. But Clara couldn't leave it there, not when every whispered rumor from Cheyenne to Dry Creek spoke otherwise. Not when she'd seen the shadows in his eyes, the secrets he carried like weight around his neck. And yet, despite the unease curling in her chest, she felt herself softening toward him. His loneliness called to hers, a quiet ache she couldn't ignore. Whispers in the dark, it was deep in the night when the creak of a floorboard woke her. Clara sat up, heart hammering, and listened. Somewhere below, the front door groaned on its hinges. She rose quietly, slipping on her shawl, and crept down the hallway until she could see the faint glow of a lantern in the main room. Jackson stood by the door, speaking in a hushed voice. To a tall, broad-shouldered stranger half hidden by shadow, she froze where she stood, straining to catch their words. "Can't stay here, Cole," Jackson hissed. "The sheriff's been sniffing around. If he catches you, don't tell me where I can or can't be, brother," the man growled, his voice rough with defiance. "I got nowhere else to run." "Brother," the stranger stepped into the light and Clara caught a glimpse of his face, strikingly handsome with sharp cheekbones and dark, reckless eyes. But there was blood on his sleeve and a worn, wanted poster protruding from his coat pocket. Cole Hale. She'd heard his name before. The wanted notices plastered in town claimed he'd shot a federal marshal dead during a botched poker game in Deadwood. Jackson pressed a hand against his brother's chest, forcing him back. "You're gonna get me hanged just being here." "Or maybe," Cole said, a bitter smile twisting his mouth. "I'll save your miserable hide one day. Don't pretend you ain't got your own sins buried out here." Before Jackson could reply, Clara stepped back into the shadows, her breath shallow, heart pounding in her ears. A house divided. The next morning, Jackson acted as though nothing had happened, moving through his chores with quiet precision. But Clara couldn't unsee the blood on Cole's sleeve, the venom in his words, or the unspoken history simmering between the two brothers. She wanted to confront him, demand the truth, but fear held her tongue. Out here, far from law or family, secrets had power, and sometimes knowing too much could kill you. Still, she caught herself glancing toward the hills where Cole had vanished before dawn, wondering if he would return, and what storm he might bring with him when he did. The quiet before the storm, the thaw came slow that year. By late spring, the frozen earth of the Wyoming plains softened underfoot, and new shoots of grass dared to stretch toward the pale sun. But even as the land seemed to breathe again, a strange heaviness hung over the Hale ranch. A silence, more oppressive than winter's howl. For Clara Mae Donovan, the days were marked by small, quiet realizations that seemed to creep up on her like shadows at dusk. Her appetite had changed. Mornings brought waves of nausea that left her trembling against the wash basin. Her body felt different, unfamiliar, as though it carried a secret too heavy for words. By the third missed cycle, she no longer needed confirmation. She pressed a hand gently to her belly one morning as she stared into the warped glass of the washroom mirror, her reflection pale and uncertain. Life. Somewhere within her, a fragile new heartbeat had joined her own. The discovery sent a storm of emotions crashing through her, fear, wonder, and something dangerously close to hope. But as her fingers brushed over the slight curve beneath her dress, another thought struck her cold. If the whispers were true, if Jackson's outlaw brother had indeed been hiding here in those late-night hours, if mistakes had been made during moments she could hardly remember through the haze of exhaustion and grief, whose child was she carrying? Secrets in the mayhem. Dark Clara tried to tell Jackson that evening, rehearsing the words as she stirred the pot of stew, but when she turned to speak, she found him already pacing the length of the kitchen, his jaw tight, his brow furrowed beneath his hat even indoors. "What's wrong?" she asked softly, setting the wooden spoon aside. Jackson paused, his hand resting on the back of a chair, fingers tapping nervously against the worn wood. "The sheriff was by today," he said finally. "He's hunting Cole. Says there's a bounty on his head big enough to bring every hired gun between here and Deadwood. And if they find out Cole came here?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson's silence was answer enough. She wanted to trust him, but every passing day seemed to bring new secrets into their home, and the walls between them grew higher. At night, when Jackson thought she slept, she heard him moving about downstairs, locking doors, loading his rifle, whispering prayers under his breath. Sometimes she wondered if the real danger lay beyond the ranch fences, or inside them. The outlaw's shadow. It was near dusk when she saw him again. Clara was hanging linens on the line when a flicker of movement caught her eye by the tree line. A lone rider on a dark horse approached at a cautious pace, his hat pulled low, the setting sun painting the edges of his silhouette in gold. Cole Hale. He swung down from the saddle with the easy grace of a man used to running from the law and walked toward her with a confidence that set her nerves on edge. "Evenin', Mrs. Donovan," he drawled, tipping his hat. "You shouldn't be here," Clara said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Reckon I shouldn't," he replied, a half-smile curving his lips. "But trouble's on my heels and I got nowhere else to ride." Before she could answer, Jackson appeared from the barn, rifle in hand, his expression as dark as the gathering storm clouds. "I told you to stay away, Cole." Cole spread his hands in mock surrender. "Just stopping by to see my big brother. Ain't family supposed to look out for each other?" Jackson stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You're bringing hell to my doorstep, and I won't let Clara get caught in it." Cole's gaze shifted briefly to Clara, his smirk faltering as something unreadable flickered in his eyes. Then he spat in the dirt, swung into the saddle, and rode off without another word. But Clara knew this wasn't over. Trouble rides fast. 2 days later, the law came riding. 5 men on horseback thundered up the long road to the ranch, dust rising behind them like a storm cloud. At their head was Sheriff Mason, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetual scowl and eyes sharp as broken glass. "Hail!" the sheriff barked as he dismounted, boots crunching on dry earth. "Word is your brother's been sniffing around here. You best pray that ain't true, or you'll both hang for obstruction." Jackson stood on the porch, his rifle resting casually against his shoulder, though Clara could see the tension in the tight set of his jaw. "Haven't seen him," Jackson said evenly. "Mind if we take a look around?" Jackson's grip on the rifle tightened, but after a beat he stepped aside. "Help yourself." The deputies searched the barns, the sheds, even the loft above the kitchen, turning over every trunk and barrel. When they finally rode off empty-handed, Sheriff Mason left them with a warning sharp enough to cut. "You see Cole Hale, you tell me first. If I find out you're hiding him, there won't be a trial." Fractures and fears. That night, Clara sat by the fire, her hands resting protectively over her belly as Jackson brooded by the window. The tension between them stretched taut as wire. Finally, she whispered, "Jackson, what aren't you telling me?" He turned slowly, his gray eyes dark with shadows. "Some things are better left buried, Clara." She flinched at the finality in his voice, but deep down, she knew one truth above all else. Nothing stayed buried forever, not out here. Not love, not secrets, not blood. The uneasy peace by midsummer, the Wyoming plains were no longer quiet. The air hung heavy with heat, cicadas droning endlessly in the grasslands, but beneath the hum of summer was a taut, unspoken tension. The Hale Ranch had always been remote, miles from the nearest settlement, surrounded by rolling prairie and distant hills. But lately, isolation felt less like peace and more like exposure. Word traveled fast, even out here. Settlers had begun fencing off lands once hunted freely by the Lakota Sioux, ignoring old boundaries, cutting deep into sacred territories. Rumors of raids whispered through Dry Creek like wildfire. Supply wagons ambushed, ranches burned, families slaughtered in the night. Every creak of the fence rails, every distant hoofbeat on dry earth, made Clara's chest tighten. She'd grown, used to frontier hardships, The endless work, the long silences, the constant balancing act between survival and dignity. But this felt different. This was danger creeping closer every day. Jackson had grown more watchful too, scanning the cow horizon whenever he rode the pastures, keeping the rifle within reach even at the supper table. He didn't speak of his fears, but Clara felt them all the same, and through it all she carried her own secret, the quiet, fluttering life beneath her ribs, a reminder that her choices no longer belonged to her alone. Cole's return. It was dusk when Cole rode in again. Clara spotted him first from the kitchen window, a lone rider cutting across the shimmering horizon, horse-lathered, posture tense. He slid from the saddle before the dust even settled, his boots hitting the ground with the restless energy of a man who'd spent too long looking over his shoulder. Jackson stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, his jaw tightening as his brother approached. "You shouldn't be here," Jackson growled. "Don't start with me," Cole shot back, wiping sweat from his brow. "The sheriff's got every bounty hunter from Deadwood to Cheyenne sniffing after me. I need a place to lay low, Jack, just for a spell." Jackson hesitated, glancing toward Clara, who stood frozen in the doorway. Cole followed his gaze and offered her a crooked, weary smile. "Mornin', Mrs. Donovan." She nodded stiffly, one hand instinctively resting against her belly. There was something different about Cole this time. The easy charm that once laced his words had dulled, replaced by sharp edges and shadows in his eyes. "You can't stay," Jackson said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Cole's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "Then at least give me a gun and a bottle of water. Trouble's riding hard behind me." Reluctantly, Jackson led him into the barn. Clara watched them go, a gnawing sense of dread twisting in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that Cole's troubles would soon become their own. Embers, in the night. That night, Clara awoke to the distant glow of fire on the horizon. At first, she thought it was lightning, but then the wind shifted, carrying with it the acrid sting of smoke. Jackson was already at the window, his silhouette tense against the pale moonlight. "Raiders?" Clara whispered. He nodded grimly. "Neighbor's ranch, most likely." They dressed quickly and went outside. From the ridge beyond their property, they could see the orange tongues of flame licking up into the sky, distant shouts carried faintly on the wind. By dawn, word reached them. The Wheeler Ranch, 5 miles south, had been burned to the ground. 2 men dead, a woman missing. Clara couldn't eat that morning. She sat at the table with her hands folded over her belly, listening as Jackson and Cole argued in low, fierce tones in the next room. "They're coming closer, Jack," Cole hissed. "You think the Hale place is safe? Think again." "I won't abandon this land," Jackson shot back. "This is our home. Home won't mean a damn thing if we're dead." The raid. 3 nights later, danger arrived. It began with the dogs barking, frantic, desperate, until their voices were drowned out by the thunder of hooves. Jackson burst into Clara's room, rifle in hand, his voice sharp. "Get down to the cellar and stay there." She barely had time to grab her shawl before the first shot rang out, splintering the porch railing. From the cellar doorway, she caught a glimpse of shadows riding hard under the pale moonlight. A dozen figures, their war cries tearing through the night air. Jackson and Cole returned fire from the porch, their rifles flashing like lightning in the dark. Clara crouched low, covering her ears, each report of the guns sending tremors through her chest. Then came the sound she feared most, a body hitting the ground. She rushed back into the main room just as Jackson dragged Cole inside, blood streaming from a gash along his arm. "They're circling," Jackson panted. "Hold this," he said, thrusting a rag into Clara's trembling hands. Outside, the attackers whooped and hollered, firing into the night as they fanned out around the ranch. Clara helped press the cloth to Cole's wound, her hands slick with his blood, her breath ragged. Cole managed a strained grin through clenched teeth. "Always knew this place'd get lively sooner or later," he rasped. Ashes and aftermath by dawn, it was over. The riders had vanished as suddenly as they came, leaving behind spent shells, trampled earth, and a single warning carved into the side of the barn: "Leave this land." Cole sat propped against the wall, pale but alive, while Jackson moved stiffly through the wreckage of the yard, his face like stone. Clara stood in the doorway, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. She had never felt so exposed, so small beneath the endless western sky. For the first time, she wondered if survival meant leaving, abandoning the ranch, the land, and perhaps even the fragile, aching bond growing between her and Jackson. But when she looked at him standing there, rifle in hand, jaw set with quiet defiance, another thought struck her with equal force. Leaving him might break her more than staying ever could. A restless heart. By late August, the relentless Wyoming summer had baked the plains into cracked earth and brittle grass. Dust clung to everything, the windowsills, the porch railings, the folds of Clara Mae Donovan's dresses. Even the air seemed thick with it, as though the land itself had turned to ash. But inside Clara, new life grew stronger with each passing day. She could feel the subtle shifts of her body now, the heaviness in her limbs, the fluttering beneath her ribs, the quiet thrum of something fragile yet unyielding. At night, lying awake beneath the thin quilt, she rested a hand over the gentle swell of her belly and whispered to the child she hadn't yet met. She imagined soft curls, tiny fingers gripping hers, laughter filling this silent house. And yet, every time she allowed herself to dream, a shadow crept in. She didn't know if the father of her child was the man lying beside her, or the outlaw brother whose arrival had thrown her life into chaos. She had buried that doubt deep, never daring to speak it aloud, but secrets had a way of rising like bones through thawing earth. A house of whispers. Jackson had grown quieter since the raid. There were nights she woke to find his side of the bed cold, his boots gone from beside the door. Sometimes she caught him watching the horizon with a rifle slung over his shoulder, as though waiting for something, or someone, to come. Cole stayed away, though his absence brought no peace. Stories drifted in from Dry Creek, 2 bounty hunters found dead outside a saloon, a poker game gone wrong in Deadwood, a stagecoach robbed at gunpoint on the Cheyenne Trail. Wherever Cole rode, trouble followed. One evening, as Clara folded linens in the loft, she overheard voices downstairs. Jackson spoke low and sharp, but she caught fragments through the floorboards. Can't let her find out. Buried it years ago. No one'll believe. Her hand stilled over the cloth, breath caught in her throat. What had he buried, and why did he sound so afraid? The locked room. The house had a room Clara was never allowed to enter. At the end of the upstairs hallway stood a narrow oak door, its brass handle worn smooth but always locked. Jackson had told her once curtly that it was storage. Old furniture, broken tools, nothing worth the trouble. But something about the way he avoided her gaze when he said it kept gnawing at her. That night, when Jackson rode into town to fetch supplies, she climbed the stairs with trembling hands and paused before the door. From her apron pocket she drew the thin sliver of metal she'd hidden weeks ago, a hairpin bent carefully into shape. It took 3 tries before the lock gave, a soft click. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and disuse. A single narrow window cast a pale beam across the room, illuminating stacks of crates and trunks, their edges softened with cobwebs. She moved slowly, every creak of the floorboards loud in her ears. At the far corner stood a cedar chest, its lid worn, but intact. Something about it drew her forward, her pulse pounding. She knelt, fingers hesitating over the latch, then lifted it with a trembling breath. Inside lay a faded blue dress, neatly folded. A woman's bonnet, a pair of scuffed boots, and beneath them, a silver locket. Clara opened it and froze. Inside, behind the cracked glass, was the smiling face of a young woman she didn't recognize. Soft brown eyes, sunlit curls, and a tenderness in her expression that made Clara's chest ache. And on the opposite side of the locket, dried petals. Tiny, brittle, pressed flat by time. A wedding flower. Ghost of a missing wife. Clara didn't hear Jackson return. She startled when his voice came from the doorway, low and rough as distant thunder. "What are you doing in here?" She spun, clutching the locket in her fist. I wanted to know the truth." His gray eyes darkened as he stepped into the room. "Put it back." "Jackson," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Where is she? Your wife. What happened to her?" He stared at her for a long, unbroken moment. Then, without a word, he took the locket gently from her hand, his fingers brushing hers with unexpected tenderness. "She's gone," he said finally. "That's all you need to know." But Clara saw it then. The grief in his eyes, yes, but something else too. A weight heavier than sorrow, a guilt that had lived inside him so long it had hollowed him out. Did you love her?" she asked softly. Jackson's jaw clenched. He turned away without answering. The knock at midnight. That night, a hard knock shook the front door, waking Clara from a restless sleep. Jackson was already downstairs when she followed, lantern light spilling into the main room. On the porch stood a man she didn't know, tall, broad-shouldered, his coat heavy with dust and road grime. His hand rested casually on the butt of a revolver at his hip. "Evenin', Hale," the man drawled. "Name's Ellis. I reckon you know why I'm here." Jackson's shoulders stiffened. "I told you, I ain't seen Cole." "Funny thing," Ellis said, stepping closer, his boots creaking on the porch. "Word is he's been hiding out here. Marshall's got a price on his head so high, folks are willing to kill anyone protecting him." Clara's breath caught as Jackson moved subtly, placing himself between her and the stranger. "You best ride on," Jackson said coldly. "You won't find Cole here." Ellis's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe. But if I find out you're lying, Hale, I'll burn this place down myself." When he finally rode off into the night, Clara stood frozen in the doorway, her heart hammering. It was no longer a question of if trouble would come. It was only when. The weight of silence, the last days of summer hung heavy over the Wyoming plains, the air thick and unmoving as if the land itself held its breath. At the Hale Ranch, unease settled deeper than the dust in the floorboards. Clara Mae Donovan moved slowly through her days now, her body heavy with the nearing birth, every step measured, her hands resting often against the swell of her belly. Nights were the hardest, long stretches of restless turning beneath thin quilts, haunted by whispers she couldn't silence. She thought constantly of the silver locket and the young woman's smile inside it. She thought of the pressed flower and the grief in Jackson's gray eyes when he found her in the locked room. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust the man who had given her shelter, who had placed his jacket over her shoulders during that first Wyoming storm, who had stood with her against raiders and wolves in a world that seemed set on breaking them. But every time she tried, doubt coiled tighter around her heart. What had happened to Jackson's first wife? And why, in the quiet hours, did she sometimes hear him whisper her name? Cole's last ride. Cole returned 2 nights before the harvest moon, his dark horse lathered, his shirt torn, a pistol still warm at his hip. Clara heard him long before she saw him, the pounding of hooves rattling the panes, a desperate sound that set her nerves on edge. Jackson met him in the yard, rifle in hand. Clara stood at the doorway, her heart hammering as she watched 2 brothers circle each other like men caught between blood and betrayal. "They're close," Cole panted, sliding from the saddle. 2 bounty hunters, maybe more. They tracked me from Deadwood to Dry Creek." Jackson's jaw tightened. "I told you, Cole, you should have run farther." "And leave you here to face him alone?" Cole spat in the dirt, his eyes wild. "They ain't just coming for me anymore, Jack. You know damn well you're on their list too." "Why?" Clara whispered before she could stop herself. Cole's gaze snapped to hers, sharp and unyielding. "Ask your husband," he said, a bitter smile twisting his mouth. Jackson said nothing. In that silence, Clara felt something cold settle deep inside her bones. The marshal's son. The following evening, a rider approached under a red-streaked sky. Unlike Cole, he came slow and steady, his horse deliberate, his silhouette framed by the sinking sun. When he dismounted, Clara saw a young man no older than 25, his jaw clean-shaven, his eyes hard as river stones. He wore a long duster coat, its hem frayed from the trail, and a silver star glinted faintly beneath the folds. "Jackson Hale," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Name's Ethan Rowe. My father was Marshall Rowe, the man your brother killed." Cole stiffened where he leaned against the porch railing, his hand drifting toward his revolver. Ethan's gaze never left Jackson. "I came for justice," he said simply, "but I'll settle for blood." Jackson stepped forward, rifle lowered but ready. "Your quarrel's with me, son, not my brother." "I reckon my quarrel's with both of you," Ethan said softly, and then his gaze flicked to Clara and his expression shifted just slightly. "Did he ever tell you what really happened the night his wife disappeared?" Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "What do you know about it?" she demanded. Ethan's jaw worked as though he were chewing over the weight of the words before he finally spat them out. She ran. From him. Truth in blood. The air between them seemed to shatter, sharp as broken glass. Jackson's voice came, low and rough. "You don't know what you're talking about." Ethan's eyes blazed. "I know my father died hunting the man who killed his wife and buried her out past the cottonwoods. I know it was your land they found the bonnet on. And I know you've been hiding behind these fences ever since." Clara staggered back, her hand gripping the porch post for balance. "Jackson," she whispered. Jackson's face was unreadable, carved from stone, but his silence said more than any denial could. Before she could speak again, Cole stepped forward, voice cold as steel. "Enough talking. This ends now." It all happened fast. Cole drew first, Ethan answered in kind, and the quiet Wyoming dusk exploded with gunfire. Clara screamed as Cole spun, blood blooming dark across his shirt. He dropped to his knees, coughing wetly before collapsing into the dirt. Jackson caught him before he hit the ground, lowering his brother gently, his face tight with anguish. "Don't you leave me, Cole," he rasped. Cole smiled faintly, his breath rattling. "Always figured I'd go out. Guns hot," he whispered, before his body stilled beneath Jackson's hands. The blood moon rises, Ethan staggered back, his revolver smoking, his chest heaving with adrenaline. Jackson rose slowly, his rifle leveled at the young man's chest. "Go," he said, voice like gravel. "Before I make you join him." Ethan hesitated, jaw working, but something in Jackson's eyes, cold and hollow and burning all at once, made him lower his weapon. "This ain't over," he said softly, before climbing into his saddle and riding into the blood-red horizon. When he was gone, the world went strangely quiet, as though even the land itself mourned Cole's passing. Clara knelt beside Jackson where he sat in the dirt, Cole's lifeless body cradled against him. "I tried to save him," Jackson whispered, his voice breaking. "Tried to save them both." "Jackson," Clara breathed. "What happened to her? Tell me the truth." He looked at her then, and for the first time since she'd arrived on this wild, untamed land, she saw the full weight of the man before her, all the pain, the regret, the ghosts he carried. "She loved me once," he said softly, "but she loved freedom more. I tried to hold her, Clara, tried to make her stay. One night she ran, right into the marshal's camp. Things turned bad. Cole pulled the trigger to save me." Clara felt her chest tighten, her breath shaky. "And you buried her." Jackson nodded slowly, tears cutting silent tracks through the dust on his face. "I buried what was left of her dreams. And maybe mine too." A fragile dawn, the next morning, the sun rose pale and quiet over the plains. Cole was buried on the ridge beneath a lone cottonwood, his grave marked by nothing more than a simple wooden cross. Jackson stood silent as Clara laid a handful of wildflowers. At the mound, the cool breeze stirring her skirts, danger still lingered. Ethan Rowe would come again, the law would circle closer, and the land, vast and unforgiving, would demand more sacrifices before it ever showed mercy. But as Clara slipped her hand into Jackson's, she felt something shift. Small, fragile, but real. They had survived the blood moon. For now, that was enough. Final beat. That night, as Clara sat on the porch, the cicadas buzzing in the tall grass, she felt the baby kick for the first time. She closed her eyes and whispered into the warm summer air. "We'll make it, little one. Somehow. We'll make it." And somewhere deep inside the house, Jackson struck a match, lit a single lamp, and opened the silver locket one last time before closing it gently, laying the past to rest.